Good afternoon, and welcome to the Aspen Institute. I'm Dana Gioia, the director of the Harman-Eisner Program in the Arts, and it is my pleasure today to have another of our Washington Idea Roundtable sessions. We have so many people today, I'm afraid that the round table had to be squared, but I think that's probably better than having people sit on the furniture or the window sills. I'm delighted that we have two special guests today, in addition to our featured star. And I just want to acknowledge them. First is Michelle Smith, whose generosity has funded this series of roundtables from the Michelle Smith and Robert H. Smith Family Foundation. Michelle, thank you so much for allowing us to bring the arts into the Aspen Institute. And secondly, as if having a poet of the stature of Kay Ryan in the room weren't enough, I'm delighted today to say that we have the pleasure of having Richard Wilbur in the audience. His presence will keep Kay and me relatively honest, I think. I mean, we can't go all the way. And I just want to say that Richard Wilbur is really one of the great men of American letters, the only living poet to have won the Pulitzer Prize twice. He was a former poet laureate, Bollingen Award winner. And over the years, especially when I was chairman, I was always being interviewed by reporters, and they would say, well, who do you think is the best living American poet? And I would give the official answer, well, there are many, diverse and generous talents in this great nation. They said, come on, tell me who you really think is. And I finally said, if I have to pick one, no contest, Richard Wilbur. Dick, thank you for coming to the Aspen Institute this afternoon. There are other distinguished people in the audience, but they're going to simply have to go unnamed because we want to keep this thing on time. It is such a pleasure to welcome Kay Ryan to the Aspen Institute at DuPont Circle. Kay Ryan is the real thing in poetry. I mean, think of the fellow in the Diamond District whose job it is to assess stones. And every day, people bring gems to them, and they look at them, and they're diamonds, they're rubies, they're sapphires. But every now and then, he finds a perfect gem. And that's the way I felt some years ago when I first discovered Kay Ryan's work. This was a poet who was just about as good as poetry gets. And this was a poet who had a kind of originality, intensity, and sprezzatura that it seems to me what the art is all about. If I was to describe Kay Ryan's poetry, I could give you sort of value-free descriptives. It tends to be short. It tends to mix free verse and metered verse in a very unpredictable way. She uses rhyme internally in all kinds of surprising way. But what I would say is that this is a poet who absolutely fulfills Robert Frost's definition that a poem begins in delight and ends in wisdom. Her poems are short, they're dense, they're playful, they're surprising, but they tend to take the shape of an idea discovering its own possibilities, and so often end with a tiny explosion of both significance and pleasure. I think that Kay is a poet who is going to be a permanent part of the American canon. And I'm happy to say that nowadays this is no longer an outsider opinion. This is sort of the mainstream. Now, she's got a very unusual background for a poet. She's, as you'll discover, has a very individual take on these things. And I'm simply going to let the rest of the introduction happen as a conversation.
You know, thank you for that beautiful introduction, by the way. That was just glorious. I was thinking, as you were talking about my poems, I was thinking for the first time that I think my poems would fit on a double bubble wrapper. You know, remember the old little square double bubbles? You could instead
Yeah.
of getting a little cartoon, you could get one of my poems.
Well, this could be what American poetry needs.
Yeah.
You know?
The double bubble series.
And as the poem reaches the climax, you could pop the bubble.
Yeah.
Well, you know, with that buildup, would it be too much to ask you to start with a poem?
Why don't I start with a short one? Okay?
Okay. Are there any others?
No, there aren't any others. I didn't know what was going to be happening today. I mean, you told me, I'm sure, but I forgot. And so I thought about a reading, and I have a little bit of the Martha Stewart impulse in me, and I thought, well, what theme could I have? You know, I mean, is it spring or what is it? And I thought, well, it's rainy. I will read rain poems or water poems, and I found out that about half of my poems have water in them, which is kind of surprising. But the one I'm going to read first, or perhaps only, is one called Crown. And it's from our own stomping grounds, Dana, the Bay Area. I was up running in the hills above, in Marin County, just above San Francisco. And it had been there'd been floods, and a tree had gone down. This is called Crown. Too much rain loosens trees. In the hills, giant oaks fall upon their knees. You can touch parts you have no right to, places only birds should fly to.
Okay. Now, Kay, you had an unusual career for a poet. Now, we know that the natural habitat of American poets is graduate writing programs.
That's right.
Yeah. You've been involved in education too. Where have you been teaching?
Well, I decided to make my career in the community college, and I decided to make it in the area of remedial English. And I like how that sounds. It sounds so noble, doesn't it? But it's completely a matter of accident. I had to, I went to college disdaining all thought of its relationship to making a living. That seemed beneath me, although I came from poor people and had absolutely no idea how I would take care of myself. So I graduated with a master's and then left later with part of a PhD with no other method for making a living but through what I had always not wanted to do, which was teach. And I didn't want to do that because my grandmother was a teacher and my mother was a teacher, and I just couldn't see anything in it. I wanted to be maybe an oil well driller like my father, you know. But I wound up teaching part-time at a community college and for 30-some years, and it worked out. Yeah.
And what sort of students have you had?
Well, I've had the people that are listed on the Statue of Liberty, you know. In that poem, right?
Yeah,
in
yes.
that great poem, yeah. The huddled masses. I've had the unhuddled masses. You know, a lot of students who, for one reason or another, didn't progress as they might have in high school. A lot of people who were financially challenged. A lot of second language students. A lot of students with learning disorders of one sort or another. And they've all been very gratifying because by the time they've come to the community college, they know they need it. I mean, they're very happy to be there and getting the skills they have suffered for the lack of.
And as Poet Laureate, you know, you have a very unusual project. You've made community colleges your project.
Yes, it's kind of horrified a lot of people. Even the Library of Congress has tried to connect it to poetry in some meaningful way. I really, the library likes one to have some kind of project these days. And so I thought, well, what can I really do? And I thought, I can I can just sort of wave the flag for community colleges and say they're these essential, ubiquitous, underappreciated, underfunded institutions that are essentially nitrogen-fixing devices that improve the soil of the communities that they're in. And that's all I want to do. And they said, well, could you say something about poetry? And and so there's some little appendix about poetry or something, but it's just a vestigial organ, really. I just want to say, yay, community colleges. And I've done that, and many community college teachers have come up to me, I mean, really with tears in their eyes, and have said, thank you so much. We love what we do, and we know how essential it is and how great our students are, but not many other people seem to understand that.
Yeah, so. It is a kind of project that is without prestige.
Utterly without
in the
prestige.
official literary world.
Yeah.
And it's, I think that, you know, it's, I mean, I think it was a noble, undertaking, if also a bad career move.
Well, it wasn't, but I want to remind you, it had no nobility in it. I just needed a job, and it was clean indoor work.
Yeah. Well, no, I think you have the project.
Yeah. Well, I just needed a project too. You know, I mean, it's not any nobility attached to it. It's just I had to throw something in the maw of requirement.
So in other words, you don't mind drilling the oil well, but the cleanup, you're kind of, sort of. Now, how did you first recognize that you were a poet?
Well, you know, I always loved fooling around with language from childhood, and the first sense of the power of language came to me at the end of 6th grade. I'd gone to a rodeo with friends of the parents of my best friend, and so I was 2 degrees removed from anybody I knew when this thing happened. And I'd never been away from my family at all. So I'm at dinner with complete strangers, and we're sitting around the table. I mean, all I know is my friend who's also at the table. And I say something, and a perfect stranger, a woman I do not know, spits her milk across the table. And I thought, if language can do that, then it is worth pursuing. And so I always enjoyed using language to be funny. Yeah. I was very attracted to poetry, but I was also repelled by it because when I was beginning to think about being a poet, it was in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And poetry was so confessional and so autobiographical and so rich in body fluids at the time that it just seemed alien to me. Yeah. And another thing is that poetry by its own nature requires great honesty, and I really didn't ever want to be honest. Yeah. So there were a lot of things keeping me from it. I wanted to be superficial, and I knew I really understood and respected the fact that poetry required that you not be superficial. And I wanted to be.
But you actually had a moment, later where you were trying to wonder whether it was, you should be a poet, and you weren't on the road to Tarsus, but it was sort of similar.
Yeah, I was on the road to Wisdom, actually Wisdom, Montana, a little tiny place.
Did you begin to delight Montana?
Okay, so I'll tell this story. So anyhow, I am resisting. I don't want to be a poet. I mean, I kind of do. I mean, I really, really do, but I really, really don't. And
which is sensible.
Yes, I think it's only sensible. So my 20s are waning. I mean, I'm still struggling. I'm a teacher by this time. I'm already at the community college. And what I find is that my mind is just writing poems all by itself. And I'm reading books. I might read a novel, and it suddenly starts rhyming. I mean, I'm reading it, I'm going, this is strange. This novel is rhyming. So odd things were happening in my mind, and it was getting more and more intense. This was also becoming 1976, which, as you may recall, some of you, was the bicentennial of the United States. And there was this great bike ride established called the Bike Centennial. And I thought that perhaps riding my bicycle 4,000 miles would give me a chance to think over whether I was going to be a poet or not. I mean, because essentially you're just sitting there, you're just sitting there. I mean, sure, your legs are, your legs are going around, but you're just sitting there. You don't have anything to do. So I sat there through Oregon and Montana, and I sat there through Wyoming, and then when I was sitting there in Colorado, going up Hoosier Pass.
Were you near Aspen?
Wow, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not that good at geography. Hoosier Pass, it's in the Rockies.
Yeah.
I should know.
We'll take credit.
I don't.
Though,
Okay, okay. It was near Aspen.
Good.
And I had one of those experiences that people like Rilke describe. When your mind loses all of its edges. When you and everything sort of merge, and you have unbelievable powers that aren't quite yours and aren't quite not yours. Once I understood that I had this and intuited that it would be brief, I thought, well, I will ask if I should be a writer. I couldn't bring myself to say poet. I just couldn't. So I said to whatever was going on there, shall I be a writer? And the answer that I received was so ridiculously perfect. It was irresistible. The answer was this: do you like it? And I did like it. I liked it with all my heart. I really did like it. I didn't know if I could do it. I didn't know if I could be a success or if I had any ability. But I absolutely did. I could. So I just laughed and knew that everything was solved. And I truly went down the other side of Hoosier Pass, knowing the course of my life. And I'm not that kind of person to have peak, experiences. So I trusted it perfectly, because it was completely foreign to my nature.
Now, your work is extraordinary originally. There's not anyone else yet that writes like you. I'm sure lots of people are starting to write like you now.
Yeah, we're waiting for the epigones.
Yeah.
Is that how you say that?
Yeah.
Or is it epigonese? Sorry.
But it took you a while to work towards this style. I mean, you started off in slightly more conventional models, and I have a copy of your first book here, and this is a book.
This is a complete betrayal, by the way.
This is a book that your first book was essentially published almost without your volition. Didn't your partner and a group of friends raised money among themselves to bring this out? Would you want to tell the story? Well,
the story's great. The story about the Mary Kay Cosmetics. Do you know this story?
I don't know if I know this.
Okay. So it's my birthday, and I think my partner Carol is taking me to dinner at the Blue Rock in Larkspur for my birthday. And so, sure enough, we get there, and we're at a small table with a few people. And there's a curtain, and I hear noise from behind the curtain. And I say to somebody I'm with, I wonder what that is. And the person I'm with says, there's a Mary Kay cosmetic convention going on, which was just irresistible, So I naturally got up and peeked through the curtain, and there were all my friends. And they were there to launch this book. So yes, essentially it was self-published.
Self-published by others.
By others, yes, yeah.
And what did you have models in terms of what you're doing? I mean, the person when you read your work who most readily comes to mind is Emily Dickinson. Was she one of the models that you had in terms of this very compressed, sort of playful, but also sort of dark style?
No. I had read Emily Dickinson, of course, and I revered her, of course. but in terms of anything conscious, I couldn't say at all that she was a model. Unconsciously, there are similarities. I mean, there is. I loved her rhyme. I mean, her rhyme was just catnip to me. And you know, I've given some thought to her rhyme. I'll bet one reason she rhymed like that was that she really never heard her poems. She never had to say them, you know, she never said them to anyone. Probably most of them were never spoken. Think of that. And so they didn't even seem like off rhymes to her. They would have seemed perfect. They rhymed in her mind, and that's where they stayed.
Yeah. Let's read a couple more poems now.
Okay.
Could you read Turtle?
I could read that.
This was a poem that, was the first poem of yours I anthologized. And I really liked the poem, but it wasn't until I sort of, I think I was reading proof that I realized that it was a personal poem. I mean, I was reading it on one level, and suddenly I realized it meant two things at once.
Wow, like a poem.
Yeah. Well,
Sorry,
I'm
Dana.
a very superficial person.
All right. This came out of a long period of frustration, as one might imagine. And it also has my very greatest rhyme in it. And I'll warn you that there are three words that collapse into one word. All the sounds are there, and no new sounds are intervening. You can try to find it.
Okay.
It'll just give you, like if you don't like content, you can just go for sound, Who would be a turtle who could help it? A barely mobile hard roll, a four-oared helmet. She can ill afford the chances she must take in rowing toward the grasses that she eats. Her track is graceless, like dragging a packing case places, and almost any slope defeats her modest hopes. Even being practical, she's often stuck up to the axle on her way to something edible. With everything optimal, she skirts the ditch which would convert her shell into a serving dish. She lives below luck level, never imagining some lottery will change her load of pottery to wings. Her only levity is patience, the sport of truly chastened things. Can you find the rhyme?
Well, I think we should have a poll.
I do too. I do too.
But it saved time to us.
Okay, all right, okay. That's very good. Practical and axle? No, because there's a little stuff in there. This is it. Okay, remember, who would be a turtle who could help it? A barely mobile hard roll, a four-oared helmet. Okay, a four-oared, and then in the next rhyme, she can ill afford. Afford. See, it's all there. Isn't the mind weird? I mean, how in the world we ever do a thing like that? It's weird.
Give us another poem.
All right. Do you have any preferences?
Well, I have many preferences, but why don't we exercise yours?
All right. Here's a little poem. 93. This is called Dew, and it's sort of investigating a quality that is very dear to me, which is lightness. And, dew is the perfect kind of emblem of something so light and delicate and subject to destruction. Dew, as neatly as peas in their green canoe, as discreetly as beads strung in a row, sit drops of dew along a blade of grass. But unattached and subject to their weight, they slip if they accumulate. Down the green tongue, out of the morning sun, into the general damp, they're gone.
Now, your work, and a lot of your literary opinions are what we would call contrarian.
I prefer not to think that that's true.
You wrote you went to the sort of convention of creative writing programs on an assignment from Poetry Magazine.
The exact name of which shall remain unspoken.
And and you made a lot of observations, which I think probably the average person would think are commonsensical, but they were treated as high treason in the poetry world. What is your relationship to to POBIZ?
To POBIZ, the business of poetry. Well, I have become completely co-opted, actually, by it. I'm one of its lackeys now. But for a long time, during my formative years, which were the first 60, I remained aloof from that world.
Yeah.
I had the idea that the way that you would get somewhere in poetry would be that you would write poems that you would hope would get, at least for some time, progressively better, and then maybe stall out, but get progressively better, and that you would send them out to editors that you didn't know, and that they would see the excellence of this work, and they would publish it, and that you would gradually work your way up into better and better magazines, and finally attain the position of Poet Laureate of the United States through this method. And it worked perfectly. It was just slow. It was just slow. Yeah. But I didn't think that you would know anybody, you know. I didn't think you would try to network. Actually, when I was doing it, we didn't even have the term network. That came in, when do you think network came in? In the 80s? Yeah. Before that, we just tried to get to know people, didn't we? You know?
Yeah. Well, now that you know everyone, what do you think of them?
Oh, I like them very, very much.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I like them very much.
You have been co-opted.
They're all wonderful, and I really was wrong about all of them. And
I'm glad to have that on record.
Yeah.
Well, let's show, maybe give a taste of the contrary in you in poetry. Could you read the poem Blandier?
Yes, unfortunately, it's starting to become, it's sort of getting Borgesian a little bit. I'll explain that in a minute. Well, there are glaciers referred to in it, and something that I want to happen in regard to glaciers, and unfortunately, it is happening. I wrote this before it started, before we knew it was happening. Blandier is a word that you may not all know. Is there anyone here who doesn't know the word Blandier? You don't know the word Blandier. Yeah, and you don't. Several people don't. I made it up. But
it's a word whose time had come.
Well, you know, low-hanging fruit, I say. Well, let's see, this is also exciting. I can't find it. The one thing I love about my new and selected is that it has a title index, which is so handy. Instead of having a bunch of books and hunting around, now I have one book and hunt around. So this will make perfect sense to you. Blandier is like grandeur, but with a bl. And it is the opposite of grandeur. And this is a prayer. Blandier. If it please God, let less happen. Even out earth's rondure, flatten Eiger, blanden the Grand Canyon. Make valleys slightly higher, widen fissures to arable land. Remand your terrible glaciers and silence their calving, halving or doubling all geographical features toward the mean. Unlean against our hearts. Withdraw your grandeur from these parts. I'm really sad about the glaciers.
But who else can we blame?
It's my fault, right? Auden was wrong. Poetry does make things happen.
And so what has your experience been so far of being Poet Laureate?
Complicated, Dana. I was a reluctant laureate because I did not want to put on the cloak of bloviation. You know? I didn't want to have to speak in general terms about poetry, and I didn't want to have to receive things. You know, like people would hand me things for poetry, and I would have to say, poetry is so glad to get this. I mean, it might be, you know, a swimming pool or something, you know, for poets. And I would have to stand there and represent poetry and take it. I just didn't want to be that sort of public figure. But then there were other things that prompted me to do it. And so I did do it, but I simply decided that I would not be much of a generalizer and would just try to represent myself, and that I would use, well, that in a way that would be a model for people, because they could say, well, you can do this and still be yourself. You can, and I think the thing is, to be a poet, you have to be headstrong and stubborn and independent and unwilling to say what you're expected to say. And so then why shouldn't the head poet for a couple of years stay a poet? So that's what I decided to do. And at first it was very uncomfortable to do that, because I felt the pressure to maybe accept the key to the city more gracefully. But then I got over it and I got used to it. And now I'm really used to it.
Okay. And, well, that's a wonderful bridge into some general questions.
Oh, good, good.
Now,
would you like me to talk about the state of poetry?
Well, no. We could save that for the end.
Let's save it for another
But since
day.
you've been co-opted, it's excellent. It's never been better.
That's right. That's right.
You know, you've lived a life where you've chosen poetry as your vocation. You've developed the capacities of language that we think of as poetry. What do you think? Not in academic terms, but for the average human being, what is the purpose of poetry? Why do we need poetry?
This is the reason. See that? That's why I didn't want to do it. Well, no, but I'm used to it now. At first, I used to just about die when that happened, but now I can stand it. Well, Dana, I'm going to tell you what I think the purpose of poetry is for non-poetry writers. Oh, I guess we'd call them poets. For non-poets, yeah. Well, a lot of people write poetry and they're not poets. But we won't go there. One time, I taught full-time, one semester. Mm-hmm. It was absolutely hideous. I'm simply not cut out for full-time work, especially in the community college, where you have to teach 5 classes and have office hours and sit on committees. It's unbearable. I mean, it's extremely difficult. It requires saints. So I couldn't write a thing. And I became one of the people who does not write. Who do not write? People who do not write, yeah. That's so hard. And as a person who could not write, who did not write, who had no voice, I suddenly really deeply understood the gift of poetry. I could read a poem and it would make me cry, because it represented something. It represented someone with a free mind, somebody in a condition of freedom, however they insisted on that freedom. They had somehow made a place in which they could think and express themselves freely, and they got to something that was precious to me, something that I couldn't do. And I think that for everybody, poetry represents a kind of condition of self, condition inside everyone that that we usually can't get at, and that it is absolutely precious. I don't know if I've said that. I mean, whatever I'm saying, I mean really strongly, but I don't know if I've said it so it can be understood.
All right, that's good. See, I'm glad I asked.
Are you?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, why don't we, I want to have some time for the audience to ask some questions. Why don't you read us a few more poems, and then we'll open it up to the general questions.
Why don't I get back to my water theme? Shall I?
I'll refill your glass.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'm going to read one called Desert Reservoirs. And I spent a lot of my early formative years, I mean, you know, before I went away to UCLA at 19, on the Mojave Desert. So some of my poetry is kind of affected by the desert. This is called Desert Reservoirs. And if any of you know desert reservoirs, they're always out, well, of course, out in nowhere, and they're completely alien. And if you're camping, you always like to tuck yourself up next to one. You always want to camp near a feature. You know, you don't want to just camp out in nothing. So you'll camp next to anything. Could be a gas station, you know. Desert reservoirs. They are beachless basins, steep-edged catches, unnatural bodies of water wedged into canyons, stranded anti-mirages, unable to vanish or moisten a landscape of cactus adapted to thrift, a wasteland to creatures who chew one another or grasses for moisture. Nothing here matches their gift.
Could you read chemise?
I'm afraid that's going to break away from my theme,
Oh, okay.
Dana. But I will. That's okay. Chemise. What would the self disrobed look like? The form undraped. There is a flimsy cloth we can't take off. Some last chemise we can't escape. A hope more intimate than paint to please.
How about one more poem?
One more, okay.
We can make it about water.
Okay, this is a wedding poem about water that has water in it. Actually, the fact that it's a wedding poem is great surprise to me. It wasn't written as such. It found its inspiration in Ripley's Believe It or Not. Its title will make that clear. A plain, ordinary steel needle can float on pure water. You know that's true, right? As a child, you may have carefully dropped a needle down onto the top of a glass of water, and it would actually float. But this has since been used as a wedding poem in several weddings, and you could have. Well, I was very surprised. I was very surprised. Who hasn't seen a plain, ordinary steel needle float serene on water as if lying on a pillow? The water cuddles up like jello. It's a treat to see water so rubbery, a needle so peaceful, the point encased in the tenderest dimple. It seems so simple when things or people have modified each other's qualities somewhat. We almost forget the oddity of that. You know, once it was used, I could understand it, but I sure wouldn't have seen it coming, you know.
Now, I'd like to open the session up for questions. We have, I think, 2 microphones, or just one? 2, okay. So just raise your hand, and that way your question, will be audible. Here.
Yes, I notice you've come to the attention of Garrison Keillor. I was wondering what you think his role in American poetry is today.
Oh, what a good question. I've come to the minor attention of Garrison Keillor. And he reads a lot of poetry. He has this thing called the Writer's Almanac on public radio, and he features a poet or two every day, doesn't he? And he celebrates birthdays and so on. He's quite wonderful in that way. So just in terms of that, he's done a lot of immediate work in just making poems part of people's daily life. But I would like to say that on Prairie Home Companion, he not only invites poets to read poems on it, which I think is fine and good. He hasn't invited me, or I'd probably feel a lot more enthusiastic about it. But what I think is great is that he has always had such fun with language. He's always fooled around with rhyme and all the pleasures of poetry that have been pretty much dropped by poetry. I mean, certainly light verse. He has reinvigorated light verse, and he does it every week, and it's just great fun. I have been very grateful to him for doing that. How about you? Yeah. It's a great gift.
You know, surprisingly, there are many poets who are sort of angry at Garrison Keillor because they somehow feel that he's been poaching on their territory, and I think that there's been he's often attacked by poets.
I think if he could just reinvigorate an interest in fooling around with rhyme and having fun and laughing, I mean, it would be a really nice world that had light verse in it again. And I know Richard Wilbur has done a great deal in that area, and children's verse. I mean, these things are wonderful. Children naturally adore poetry.
Another question? Meryl, wait for the...
Now, listening to your poetry, and especially the last one about the needle on the water, I don't know why I'm saying this, but how much is fragility something you think about a lot? The fragility of life, the fragility of feeling?
Well, I don't think I even have to think about it, because it's just so. So I don't, I understand that.
One second, Jerome.
The question I have to ask is something that I, as a singer, that have sung many songs, and Dana knows a lot of the Schubert Lieder. You could say, well, this is a great poem, but this isn't a great poem, but the music is always great. And you go to many parties and you hear people read their poetry. They don't have any rhyme, they don't have meter, and I'm saying to myself, is this poetry? So I really would like to get some sort of definition of what you consider good poetry. I know that's very difficult to answer. It's very subjective.
I always turn to Dana for this.
But I'm going to turn back to you.
Didn't I already do this one? Well, okay. All right. I would say good poetry satisfies on many levels, and I think you've brought something up. A song may please through its lyrics or through its music. I think that poetry had better please both in terms of its lyrics and its music. It is language which is memorable. It offers immediate pleasures. It had better offer immediate pleasures, and then right beneath those pleasures are more levels of pleasure. And I would think that one of the tricks of poetry, or one of the things that indicates poetry to me, is that you feel, after you've encountered it, more like yourself than you did before you encountered it. In other words, it makes you feel looser and energized, even maybe if it's about, even if it's incredibly sad subject matter or tragic subject matter, that you are more alive having read it.
Well, I think Eric was up first, so Lydia, bring it up here.
Thank you. If not Emily Dickinson, who are the poets that you continue to go back to that have informed your own poetic sense and your own poetic form and taste?
Well, who knows? I mean, Robert Bly always says, plow it under, right? He says, plow it under. Your influences are plowed under. I don't know if we should be able to answer questions like that. I think they're really for other people to find. Borges made a beautiful observation in one of his essays. He said that each new writer creates his predecessor. I mean, the line is figured out after he exists, and you see it backwards in a new way. Makes a new line all the way back to the Greeks or whatever, but that it isn't an inevitable coming forward at all. I could tell you some writers that I have always admired. Robert Frost, for sure. And I was very, very impressed by Hopkins when I first started college. And I know I wasn't wrong about that. I was very, very moved. I remember hearing, Margaret, are you grieving over golden groves unleaving? And I just thought, oh my God, this is what it is, So those are some. John Donne, of course. Cavafy. That's enough.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Gigi, we'll just pass it right next.
I want to know if being in Washington has affected your work. Has it changed your work? What do you think of Washington as a poetry town?
It has completely paralyzed my work. I think it's I really like being in Washington, but I can't get any writing done here. But happily, I'm not here. I don't mean happily in that sense. I'm not here very much, living in California as I do. I think that Washington has been, and being the laureate has given me a terrific vacation from myself, and it will be kind of nice to go home again. And I don't know what kind of town it is for poetry.
Okay, there's a.
I was struck by your comment about Emily Dickinson, how her poems always stayed within her head as she imagined them, perhaps rather than not as she spoke them. And when I've been to the Dodge Poetry Festival, the most critical thing for me is hearing the poetry being spoken aloud to release that voice of recognition in myself and in the audience. And so when you work, do you read your poetry out loud? Do you listen to it as you write it? Or is that only when you finish it?
I hear everything. I hear language. When I read, I'm a slow reader because I hear it when I read it. So for me, there's no difference between reading and speaking.
The voice is never separate.
No. As a matter of fact, it kind of frustrates me when people hear me, as you have, say, read poems, and they say, oh, it really comes alive to me now. I understand it so much more fully. I appreciate it so much more. Because I mean to have put every single thing on that page that anybody needs to get it all out. I mean, and if it isn't there, then I'm not doing as complete a job as I mean to be doing. I want all the cues to be there. I want you to be able to know from each word and all the grammar how you should say that. If you were going to read it aloud, you should be able to read it aloud as well as I can read it aloud. That's what I would like to say. I don't know if that's true for other people, but that is how I feel about it. And I don't care that anybody ever heard my voice out loud. I care about the writing in the book. That's where it matters to me. And I don't really like to hear other people read their poetry. Unless I already love the poetry. Then I like to hear them. But I don't like to be introduced to poetry that way. It's much too assaulting. It comes too fast. I want to read it for myself. Not to put too fine a point on it.
Yeah. Ethelbert?
Could you talk about the revision in terms of the short poem, in terms of do you take out words or do you replace, and also the use of white space on the page?
Well, I like to use a lot of white space on a page. Or I like to interrupt it, not too much, I guess you could say. I rewrite my poems many times, but most of the rewrites occur in 3 or 4 hours. I write a poem in a morning. I may tinker with it later, repeatedly and a little bit, but I write it, and I often start with the title. Sometimes I go back and add a title, but sometimes the title is the thing that I'm going to say.
Describe your creative process. I mean, a typical writing day.
Well, I don't have them anymore, but I'll describe typical writing days that I used to have. I would get up in the morning, and I would have some breakfast, and I would read the paper, and then I would go back to bed and take out my yellow tablet on a clipboard. My dictionary is right there beside me too. And let's see. No, I've gotten ahead of myself. First of all, I would probably read something really exciting to me. And that tends to be certain essays by Kundera or Calvino or Nabokov or Brodsky. Where are the great women essayists of that sort? I don't know why that is like that. And I would just read things that I'd read before, just randomly through the book, whatever suited me that day. Recently I've been reading, I've been reading Montaigne, which is just absolutely, I mean, I can hardly open the book before I have too much going on in my head, It's just, you just go, okay, I put that, and then, so anyhow, some little tickle happens in my head, which is just about at the tickle size. And then I get out my tablet, which I've already described, and I try to make that tickle. It's something so ineffable, or something so unnamed that I have to blow it up. I have to cartoonify it or create some kind of puppets to act it out. I have to say it too hard and too loudly and too clearly and with colors too primary in order to give it any body at all. So I'm trying to make something exist that didn't exist, and sometimes it turns out, and usually it doesn't. So I have maybe 10 or so sheets of yellow paper which I staple together and put away and look at later and see if it was any good or not. But I always try to get something done. I try to get it done. Whether it's good or isn't good, I usually don't abandon it. I usually finish it.
Okay. I think, Claudia?
What do you think is or are the best, the most successful ways that poetry reaches the non-academic public these days?
Wow. When you care about poetry, you're kind of not in a position to answer that question. I don't know how people are getting poetry. How does it go out and get them?
Right. You mentioned light verse as something you wish were more widespread.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that I think is just fantastic, and that is the program that Dana introduced at the National Endowment for the Arts, Poetry Out Loud, which gets zillions of high school students reading poetry and reciting it competitively. like a spelling bee. And this is set up, it's a whole program that goes up to the national level where the state winners come here to Washington and have the recite-offs and win scholarships and take great glory home to their schools. And they have a magnificent time. And that just spreads everywhere. And it catches people when they're really young and really love it. And so, I don't know, but I think that's very hopeful. And that would get a lot of families involved in it too. The littler kids, the parents, everybody would be participating in that. I just hope that goes like crazy. I know it's getting bigger and bigger. It takes a long time to really institutionalize that like spelling bees, but I believe it's going in the right direction. I couldn't think it was a better idea. I loved getting up and reciting poetry. Okay, I'm not contained between my hat and boots. I loved getting up and reciting poetry in groups. It was called choral reading. When I was in 6th grade, we did that. So I don't know, all those things that get kids, just get that language reverberating in them. They don't have to understand it at all, just a little tiny bit, but just to have it moving in them, and I think that's great.
Thank you.
Maybe take 2 more questions, and then I think, sorry.
I have 2 related questions about form. I noticed that your poems seem to hover about the sonnet form. That is, they all seem to be about 14 lines. There seems to be a rhyming couplet at the end, as in the Shakespearean sonnet. How important is the sonnet form to your writing? And the second question is about traditional forms in general. I know that Richard Wilbur has written about the power of writing in traditional forms. And I noticed also that Joseph Brodsky has stated that Pablo Neruda could not be considered a great poet because he never wrote in traditional form. How important do you think it is to the poet to write in traditional forms?
Well, let's start with the first question. What was it? Oh, the sonnet. You know, I think that you've got something there. I don't think that I ever thought about it, but I do think you could say that the sonnet kind of makes an argument and a counter argument and ends with a little, and my mind works that way a lot. I like argument. I like setting something up, knocking it down, or knocking it down and then setting it back up. And I like to end with a punch. And as far as the rhymes go, I don't know if they tend to have well, they probably do have some kind of rhyme that goes on at the end. I don't like to leave that word just hanging there usually. So I think they have some relationship, but it seems so corrupt that it's hardly worth making the point, But I do like that kind of breath. You're right. I do like that short breath. But, if you took my words, if you took the number of words and lined it up into iambic pentameter, we wouldn't even get halfway through a sonnet before my poem was over. So in terms of word count, they're really emaciated sonnets.
Aerobic.
Aerobic, yeah. Anaerobic. Form. I just never had any gift for it. I don't think this is the problem. I don't know who much else besides the great Richard Wilbur can really handle form supplely and with deep understanding and history. A lot of people are trying form now, but they're trying it like babies. They're using it, but they're so young in it. They're so young in it that it doesn't feel natural. I mean, certainly Frost was able to do it, and Richard Wilbur does it, but I don't know a lot of contemporary poets using it. Dana uses it very well. I think we do live in a world now where we can't limit good poetry to form, to something that has what we would consider conventional form. But I think we should leave a great big space that isn't sufficiently occupied for form, because it's a very, very rich, enriching, and disciplining thing, and liberating thing.
Okay, do we have a final question? Pia.
Would it sort of clarify what you were saying if by form to say that what you mean by form is metrical form, that is regularly recurring patterns of syllables? I mean, that is what, in this discussion about form, you're really talking about metrical verse rather than verse that isn't necessarily counting syllables in the line?
I don't know what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I think I was just trying to talk generally about something that looked like a sonnet or a sestina or things of that sort. Metrical and rhyming. But there are many other ways to organize poetry, right?
That's the point I was getting at, and I wanted to be sure I wanted to be clear about whether that was metrical was a distinction that was of interest to other people, because that's what people think of.
Let me say this. One of the things that all poetry has to have is form. Okay? It's got to have some kind of form. It cannot simply be shapeless. It has to have some kind of meaningful rhetorical form of argument, parallel. There has to be something that gives us a sense that we're in the presence of something with a beginning and an end and sides. I think it should also have sides. You can quote me on that. I never thought about that before, but it's really essential that it have sides. Mine are really close together. Most people are a little farther apart. But whether it's traditional or not, there is no question but that one of the elements of poetry is that it is formed. It is language in very meaningful order and self-conscious order.
Yeah, it's just a question of how one shapes it.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to end with a poem.
Oh, I think I'll read If She Only Had 1 Minute, since I only have 1 minute. You know how people speculate on what they'd do if they just had a minute to live or a day to live or something like that? Well, this is a poem about that. If she only had 1 minute, what would she put in it? She wouldn't put, she thinks. She would take. Suck it up like a deep lake. Bloat indiscriminate on her last instant. Feast on everything she had released, dismissed, or pushed away. She would make room and room, as though her whole life of resistance had been for this one purpose. On the last minute of the last day, she would drink and have it, ballooning like a gravid salmon or the moon.
Thank you, Kay Ryan.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for coming to the Aspen Institute.